That's it. Welcome to the panel, and we will get started straight away with Sumitra Thunder, whose talk is called "Am I Queer Enough? What It Means to Perform Queerness in India and South Asia." Thank you very much. Please welcome her.
Good morning. Okay, thank you for this opportunity to present my current work. Though my larger doctoral work deals with contemporary art practice in India, I'm going to be talking about this particular performance and its power to act as a tool of resistance, and it's something that I've been working on for a year now. This research hopes to produce a play performance by women that address what it means to be in public spaces as a queer person. And it will also interrogate what queer means to members of the community in my Indian context. So again, it's a work in progress, so there's a lot of stuff I will be talking, little things I'll be talking about. But hopefully this can, over the next year, we'll produce a performance and I'll be able to bring it back here or to other international platforms. So this is something that, as I was reading, found resonance with the way I look at what queer is. Jill Dolan in her 2002 work. So the performance of queer is both a cultivated and instinctive form. The position that India finds itself with regard to queerness is a disregard for the ways in which LGBTQ study subjects confront interlocking systems of oppression. So when does desire become queer, or when is desire queer? For the premise of this paper and the material presented in it, queer means that which falls outside the margins of normal or accepted social behavior. This paper is an attempt to look at the ways in which queer is performed within the community, as well as the ways in which the performative is used by queer persons to reflect their identity. The question, am I queer enough, interrogates the way in which queerness is perceived both by LGBTQ plus people and those on the outside. So, sorry, I'm just a little nervous. The idea of writing this paper, as well as commencing on a project to develop a performance piece, came from a few conversations with some of my friends and peers in my institute. What we were concerned with was the increasing sense of labeling within and outside the community, as well as a feeling of being appropriated. It has been observed that the title of queer is appropriated by many. What I mean to say here is that there are people who come to terms with their sexuality at a young age, who have access to media that no longer marks them as caricatures or is derogatory of LGBTQ plus people. It's easy to inhabit a fluid space without understanding the political implications of coming out or identifying as LGBTQ and others. The danger here is that those who have faced oppression and violence because of their identity must share the space with those who have the privilege of occupying the space, as well as the heteronormative world. When I ask, am I queer enough? It's a question to the community as well as to those who perform queerness outside the community. It is to problematize what defines queer and to understand whether it needs a definition at all. What performance does is resist. This is seen as multiple forms in performance where artists use it as a way of expressing their identities. There are many ways in which desire is imagined and manifests. For example, the memorialization of the Jewish Holocaust has become an object of desire for many groups who seek public acknowledgement of their own historical traumas. Desire for the transgender body, which is received with much fear and violence towards those expressing it, is seen as pathological or fetishistic. This is by Schilt and Westbrook, written in 2009. The desire to be sexually acceptable, evident in both the gay pursuit of same-sex marriage and the Jogati, embrace of new identity. I'll explain what the Jogati is in a minute. That of the ex-Devadasi or slave and the conventional marriage that she can enter. This can be understood as the desire to be free from violence and humiliation. These two terms that I use are basically, so the Jogati or the Devadasi are those who have been promised to or in one way betrothed to a goddess. And this is a performance that happens in southern India around the time of Dasara. So I'm using this as a sort of marker of what desire could imply. The mark of being queer is not just in the flamboyant expression of it, but in owning your self-identified gender and sexuality and a deep belief in what has created this identity. Performance can also be a great tool for activism and is slowly becoming a more practiced art form in urban LGBTQ plus circles. The art is the bridge to many social issues and public policy or rhetoric are not able to articulate. So I see performance as a liberating force. Performance also has a significant, if not central, role in the avant-garde art movements also, as most of us might be familiar with. So now I'm going to move on to queer activism in India and India, if that was more inclusive. Today there's an ample amount of material that speaks of the Indian state and its action against the queer community. For example, there is the image of a protest from December of 1998. I'm sorry I don't have the image, I couldn't find an appropriate one, where a woman holds a placard saying Indian and lesbian. These are the images used as tools when demonstrating even during pride marches across the country. And since 2013, initiatives like the Niga Queer Fest that began in 2007, Queer Art Movements India and individual artists have been using performance to address issues facing queer people in the country. There is no dearth of instances where performance has been used, but it can be taken to a level where it creates enough of a rupture to break our imagination of desire and what queer means. This is one step closer to where we need to be when it comes to using performance as a tool. Artworks exhibited in the Siddhartha Hall during the 2010 Niga Queer Fest raised the questions of what a post-377 world would mean to the community. Article 377 is what penalizes unnatural acts, unnatural, I'm sorry, I'm not articulating it properly. So the question, acts against the order, thank you very much. So the Niga Queer Fest of 2010 asked the questions, what does sexual freedom mean in our current location and time? Does asserting one's queer identity liberate, affect, change, or even cause a little dent or nudge to a heteronormative social order? So there are a number of art forms that are used, and being queer in India, especially coming out and being publicly queer, is a dangerous position. Often those who are publicly out come from a certain privilege. This is perhaps the case in other countries as well, where class and skin color play a big part in how okay it is to come out of the closet or perform your gender in public spaces. Students in many institutions have been ostracized, blackmailed, and physically assaulted for being gay or perceived as gay. This violence can be anything from non-acceptance, silence, and denial, to not acknowledging partners and alternative families, to microaggressions, corrective rape, house arrest, aiding and abetting suicide, or even murder. My observation is that a large number of Indian people are afraid of expressing themselves and speaking about their queerness, especially because they are subjected to violence that is legitimized by law and social standards. A distinction I want to make here is that identifying as queer or performing queer is taboo and not illegal. It is the actual intercourse that is deemed unnatural, which puts the performing of queer in a different space, since anything outside of heteronormative expression of gender and sexuality raises questions of morality and is unacceptable. What queer is and means is a divergence from heteronormative, which is met with violence. Performance of the queer or performing queerness is also about desire for different possibilities of bodies, desire to dress differently, desire not to fit in. At this point, there are more questions with our group of the collective with us than fieldwork, reports, and analysis. So far the discussions have been around developing a script and collecting stories of how people perceive queer. We imagine it as a series of monologues and conversations. The aim is to have a fully developed production by the end of this year. So queer art, queering art. While I was looking for material for this paper, I came across the narrative of a conference that engaged with the idea of queer art, written by Renate Lorenz. The preface indicates how the conference was structured. What emerged during this conference was the idea of the freak or a freaky body, the idea that such a figure could be in the position to represent a wide variety of differences without producing a category or identity, without defining a norm from which it deviates. This is quite similar to the idea that I have that the queer body is not a deviant one, but a category on its own that is inherently fluid and therefore powerful to perform. Expression of queer in India is also informed by different social and political frameworks that do not necessarily tie in with what is perceived as unitary queer identification. At this point, I would, actually no, I'm going to just stick to my subject. Art practice and expression are effective ways of getting across the point of several social issues and have an inherent way of becoming an extension of protest and dissent. The intersecting worlds of art and activism that often are hyper-performative is the area that interests me and which is where, okay then. Just give me one moment. So, one of the key statements I'd like to make before I get into the concluding notes of this is that in what I've observed in India is that it has been art practiced in queer spaces and not art practice that is queer. Some examples of curated visual art shows and festivals include the Niga Queer Festival, now called the Queer Fest, and a number of other things. One imagined outcome of this project is an archive for queer works of art and artists who are queering practice. The second would be a series of conversations, as I mentioned before. And just for fun, this is this really nice paragraph that can everybody read this? It's a little long. I'll just hold on maybe a few seconds and then move on. So, how queer is informed? Okay, there is a body of literature and critique that challenges many of the assumptions and underpinnings of conventional understanding. And a key framework of thought is reading and understanding alternative sexuality. Queering also challenges what can be called a gay unitary identity. Let's take, for example, the presence of women or women expressing desire. That women feel desire and are capable of expressing has become such a problem that when women come out to their families, it results in organized violence like corrective rape. Of course, this is... How much time do I have? Okay. Let me just mention some endnotes and just stop here because this is a longish paper and I didn't realize it was going to be this long. I'd like to stop here as the subject is wide and there is scope for more discussion. As it is a work in progress, I'd like to end with some open-ended questions and comments. The research that has been done till now has opened up a lot of potential directions that the study could take. At the beginning, the questions were about the idea of defining a queer identity through performance, and it has since expanded into looking at the art historical significance of performance that challenges heteronormativity. The distinction made is that queerness is not necessarily the only challenge to heteronormativity. Queering performance also sets forth this challenge and can achieve interesting results. So the question, am I queer enough, also resonates with the question of am I feminine, masculine enough, which is asked in a number of situations where heteronormativity has set benchmarks for these terms. Performance can challenge these benchmarks or imaginations and also serve better as tools of resistance. What will drive this work from now on is the power that performance brings to questioning culture. And thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting, and it's we're just going to hold off questions to the end. So please hold on to those. I obviously made a bit of a boo-boo, and I did not introduce Sumitra properly. She is a curator and researcher based in Bangalore, India. Her research interests are in the fields of contemporary art, gender studies, and urban art practices, which obviously we've had a little bit about. She's worked in various capacities in the arts and culture sector in India, and she's currently finishing her PhD in contemporary art practice, and hopes to pursue research and teaching. She also enjoys, which I like, hot cocoa and hiding in quirky bookstores. Let's move on to our next speaker. Our speaker is Gabriel Semerene. So, yeah, hi, come on down. Let's get your Yes, please, please. Is this how you make it full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Gabriel is a doctoral student in Arabic literature in France. He has come today to talk to us, and his talk is entitled, and I'm sorry if I don't say this.
Mithlī, mithlak.
Mithlak, Language and LGBTQ Activism in the Mašriq. Mašriq, sorry. Yeah, please begin. Thanks.
Thank you. Hello. So I'm Gabriel Semerene. I'm a doctoral student in, well, I've been introduced. And this presentation entitled Mithlī, mithlak, Language and LGBTQ Activism in the Mašriq is the result of my research, a part of my research on the emergence of sexual identities in the Arab Middle East. So what I'm interested about is how LGBT groups that are quite recent in the region, they've existed for since the early 2000s, have reappropriated language, or are trying to reappropriate language by three means. The first of them is the coinage of new neutral gender and sexuality related vocabulary, which was inexistent before. The second of them is by tackling the use of foreign languages within the LGBT activist communities, which is considered excessive by some and necessary by others. And the third issue is the reappropriation of slurs and derogatory terms, such as the word, the same way that the word queer or even gay was reappropriated earlier in the West. How do you say homosexual in Arabic? A passage from a book by Lebanese author Rashid Daif exemplifies the current shift in the vocabulary, since the term mithlī, or mithliya in the feminine, came to be used as an acceptable appellation for people who are sexually attracted to individuals of the same gender. In the book, while attempting to inform an Egyptian colleague that another character was homosexual, the protagonist uses the French abbreviation homo, and then adds the Arabic mithlī to make sure his interlocutor understands him. It so happens that mithlī sounds quite like mithlī, which means like me. Confused, the Egyptian character asks, mithlī, mithlak, a homosexual like you? To the great embarrassment of the protagonist. This anecdote exemplifies the novelty of this term. Many people, including intellectuals, may not yet be familiar with this new trend, preferring more traditional, sometimes pejorative, Arabic words or borrowing from European languages. Mithliya jinsiyya, which means homosexuality, itself is a calque on the word homosexual. The Greek homo, equal or same, is equivalent to the Arabic mithl. Above-ground LGBTQ rights activism is relatively new in the Arabic-speaking Middle East. Early on in 2000s, a few LGBTQ activist groups were established. Examples include Halim in Lebanon, and Mim as well as Lebanon, and Al-Qaws and Aswat in Palestine. Those are the groups I'm more interested in. Although largely concentrated in Beirut and major Palestinian cities, the actions of these groups echo beyond the borders of their nation states, influencing nascent LGBTQ activism as well as sexuality-related discourse in general throughout Arabic-speaking societies. So the first issue is the issue of neologisms, or new words. The first attempts to establish a glossary of terms to address LGBTQ issues in Arabic can be traced back to the end of the 1990s. In 2003, the blog Bint Nas, managed by a group of queer Arab American women called Mujaddar Girls, published a bilingual glossary of positive expressions in Arabic. I have it here. There. That included mithliya, transcribed as misliya with an as, for homosexuality, muzdawij for bisexual, and mughayyir for transgender. More recently, the Palestinian LGBT group Al-Qaws released Qamu Qaws, a wordplay on the words qamus, dictionary, and qaws, rainbow, an Arabic only lexicon defining phrases related to sexuality. Compared to Bint Nes's glossary, Camel Qaus appears to reflect the more actual use of these phrases now that they have greater recognition. The English language denomination queer, for instance, is simply transcribed as queer, for those who can understand Arabic, which has become a popular term, whereas the glossary published on Bint Nes, in the glossary was published in Bint Nes, it was translated as Ahrar al-Jins, roughly free in sexual orientation. So at first they tried to create a translation for queer, and then they just capped the word queer phonetically. The initiative was first motivated by the urgent need to be able to talk about non-normative sexuality in neutral terms. Traditionally, male homosexual relations have semi-officially been labeled liwat in reference to sodomy, and female ones sihaka, linked to the term tribadism. The concept of liwat, however, cannot be equated with homosexuality, for it only describes a sexual practice. It therefore cannot adequately encapsulate identities and affects. Such translation efforts are not only about coining politically correct terms. Language is a reflection of social categories and classifications, and in this case, the aim is to point to current interactions between sexuality and identity. The emergence of modern sexual identity and LGBTQ activism in Arab societies has been the subject of an intense debate. This activism was critiqued and problematized famously by Colombia-based academic Joseph Massad, for example, who argued that naturalizing the link between same-sex relations and identity has the potential to harm individuals who engage in same-sex practices by pressuring them to conform to categories they don't necessarily fit into, articulate their sexual practice as an identity, and make public an aspect of their being they might hitherto have relegated to the private sphere. Many LGBTQ activists responded by arguing that cultivating such identities is necessary in order to confront hegemonic heteronormativity. They claimed that their identities and activism was not a simple import from the West, but an endogenous reaction to a regime of compulsory heterosexuality and the criminalization of alternative forms of desire, as argued by Ghazan Makarem, one of the founders of Helm. Curiously, the term Mithlī has imported itself quite rapidly, even among those who wish to denounce what they consider to be an unnatural behavior. It is increasingly used by mainstream media and the government. For instance, in reaction to the legalization of same-sex marriage in France in 2013, Marwan Sharbil, then Lebanon's Minister of Interior, called same-sex marriage zawaj mithlin, while affirming, which means marriage of homosexuals, using the term mithlin, the new term, while affirming that Lebanon was against luwat, sodomites, in the same sentence. Terms such as mutahawil, which means transgender, is the waji, intersex, and even ghayriya, heterosexual, have yet to receive the same attention. Sorry, how much time do I have?
You've still got 8 minutes.
Okay.
7 minutes.
Perfect. So the second issue, the role of foreign languages. Western languages overwhelmingly English play an important role in the LGBTQ movement. The Arabic words created by LGBTQ movements themselves are mainly based on existing Western ones. In the Lebanese context, the reappropriation of and Arabization of foreign words is quite common. This is especially true when it comes to the subject of sexuality. In an interview at Marsa, a sexual center in Beirut, I was explained that many patients do not feel comfortable expressing themselves in Arabic when detailing intimate acts. People will often shift to English and French when talking about sex. To Palestinians, the language issue is connected with political resistance. Languages other than Arabic, especially Hebrew and English, are also part of daily life. Palestinians living inside the State of Israel are often more proficient in written Hebrew than in literary Arabic, which led to the queer women's activist group Aswat to organize language reclaiming workshops. Besides adopting and translating terms from the Western LGBTQ vocabulary, such as Mithlī, Palestinian LGBTQ activists also seek to come up with more organic ways of speaking about gender and sexuality in Arabic. This is why, besides Qamu Qaus, El Qaus has initiated projects such as Ghaniyan an Ta'rif, which is which are actually, they encourage people to make songs about their sexuality, about their identities, and they made videos about it. It's quite a bit long, actually. I'm going to skip it. Sorry. You can look it up on the internet, on their website. And by encouraging LGBTQ Palestinians to make music about their experiences, the organization is also creating a space for non-academic discourses on sexuality and gender identity. For the Palestinian movement, language is a contentious topic when it comes to dealing with Israeli allies. Despite the fact that some LGBTQ activists in Lebanon prefer using Arabic, it would be unusual to deplore the use of English when debating issues related to LGBTQ people in Lebanon, whereas in Palestine, people try to keep these debates in Arabic. Although lacking an activist movement per se, Jordan is the birthplace of Macaulay, an openly LGBTQ online magazine. Entering its 8th year, Macaulay's content is almost exclusively in English. According to founder Khalid Abdelhadi, the decision to publish the magazine in English was partly influenced by the fact that this language is accessible to a more progressive demographic. Macaulay did, however, launch their first bilingual issue in September 2015, which is this one. The use of foreign languages as a form of protection from what is considered to be a more conservative part of the population is a strategy adopted, consciously or not, by many LGBTQ media in the region. There appears to be, nonetheless, a realization that by rendering such material inaccessible to those who might not be comfortable reading in English, they are not only excluding less privileged social classes, but also avoiding the popularization of the issues with which they are concerned. So the third and last issue, which is the reappropriation of the words that hurt, reclaiming the words that hurt. If coming up with a new vocabulary and managing the influence of foreign languages are without a doubt complex and politically charged projects, reclaiming insults has proven to be the most transgressive and contentious part of this linguistic endeavor. Reappropriating slurs is nothing new when it comes to historically oppressed minorities. The word queer itself is used in the English language to describe someone who doesn't fit in, especially in the way they perform their sexuality and gender. Spread around the globe beyond the Anglosphere, the term lost its original symbolic charge. Many LGBTQ activists in the Arab East will identify themselves with the English term queer. There is, however, a trend to reclaim existing slurs in the Arabic language, notably the word shaz. Shaz, which means deviant, was the center of the 2010 campaign for the International Day Against Homophobia in Lebanon, titled Ana Shaz, I'm a deviant, shaz being an alternative transcription of shaz with a Z, as you see here. Sada Murad, a scholar, pointed out that reclaiming the word was far from consensual. The stigma carried by the slur is still too great for some people to feel comfortable using it. She says, and I quote, "While queer has been reclaimed in the United States, shaz still carries the stigma of deviance in a Lebanese and broader Arab culture context. As one Lebanese queer activist pointed out in an interview, people in the community are divided around terminology, with many being uncomfortable with the use of shaz. In addition to that, reclaiming derogatory words goes beyond the intent of creating a positive identity. This identity is rather rendered entirely political and relational, with individuals claiming certain identities within the social context in which they find themselves. It is also a way to deny the binary framework that is implicit in the notions of heterosexuality and homosexuality, as well as their translations in Arabic. The wish to reclaim shaz and similar terms stems from a growing unease in using both English and Arabic binary terms to define non-normative sexual and gender identities." That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So our next speaker is Dushant Patel. would you like to come up? She is a performance artist and independent researcher, and she researches the intersections between diaspora, identities, and performance. So I'll just pull up your... That's right? Yeah. Great. Great, and her paper is entitled Queer Continents, Club Kali's World Making.
Hi. Yeah, I've written there that I've done a BA at Queen Mary, so I don't actually have affiliation to them. I just finished a degree with them. So I'll get cracking. Hold up. In the book Impossible Dance, Fiona Buckland wrote that New York's queer clubs engage in a process of making queer worlds. They do so by, oh shit, I should have said, this is early research. So if anyone has thoughts or feelings about Club Kali, then hit me up, because I want to interview you when I find time. Yeah, New York's queer clubs engage in a process of making queer worlds. They do so by providing a safe place for queer people to live and dance and to make fashions and artworks and dialects. Club Kali, a North London night of dancing, engages in queer world making in relation to existing worlds, which normally exclude its visitors based on their sexuality, gender identity, or race, amongst other things. Club Kali seeks to find a space for its founders and visitors to exist in their whole selves by adapting the conventions of mainstream LGBT+ clubs. It engages in queer world making to the extent that it cultivates a small part of the wider queer world where some, but not by any measure, all South Asian queers can belong through disidentification. So, Club Kali is a bi-monthly LGBT club where Eastern beats blend with Western classics in North London. The club's website explains that it was established in 1995 by two British South Asians as a means to regenerate, to provide a strong united community which could come together to celebrate our diversity. The night consists of clubbers dancing to music predominantly from India, as well as drag performances that complement the dancing. The club recently hosted an event in Soho, London. The CK Social took place at Bar Soho and was described in promotional materials as an after-work Wednesday evening of queer entertainment. Oh yeah. Jose Esteban Munoz describes disidentification as being a way in which minority individuals identify with cultural texts that have not been made for them. Munoz's theory is that when an individual is very rarely represented in the public sphere, they manage to identify with dominant cultural texts by adapting their meanings. For example, and this is where the picture makes sense now. For example, as a nerdy British Desi teenager with repressed bisexual desires, I was gripped by the imagined picture of a brown Harry Potter, a brown Hermione Granger, and a brown Ron Weasley having orgies in their dormitories in between fighting evil. Through these imaginations, my teenage self took a dominant cultural text made for the dominant groups in British society and altered it so that I could fit within J.K. Rowling's depiction of a world. Club Kali similarly reconfigures dominant cultural texts so that some of its guests can fit into the worlds created by those texts. Now, Munoz describes this process of disidentification as happening between the minoritarian subject and the majoritarian public sphere. I've taken the majoritarian public sphere to mean something similar to what Louis Althusser calls the ideological state apparatus. This is made up of almost everything we witness in our daily lives, from the laws that govern our sexual relations to the TV shows that we witness. To my mind, ideological state apparatuses, which are public and private institutions ranging from mass media to the family to religion, to me, they work together to create the majoritarian public sphere. Through these ideological state apparatuses, individuals are presented with human-constructed representations of the real world that are usually created by the ruling groups of people in a society. We might call these representations ideologies. Individuals knowingly or unknowingly subscribe to these ideologies when they feel personally addressed by one, or when it calls to them because that representation of the world makes great sense to the person. when individuals have to alter the meaning of a book or movie or any other cultural text so that it calls to them in the same way, they are disidentifying. In recent years and decades, this is a quote from Jasbir Puar, some, though not all or most homosexual subjects, that's the end of the quote, have come to form part of the majoritarian public sphere of the UK and many Western countries. Lisa Peñalosa's survey of representations of homosexual people in US marketing found that white, upper-middle class, straight-looking people have been integrated into the majoritarian public sphere at the expense of those more distanced from and threatening to the mainstream. And you can see the different kinds of politics playing out in this picture from KU Bar in Soho. So, Club Gali being an LGBT plus night run by British South Asians and mostly frequented by other South Asians, including non-British nationals, would appear to be threatening to the mainstream. At the club, people dance predominantly to Bollywood music while intermittently being treated to dance performances from some of the club's regular chutney queens, trans community and drag artistes. These are gatherings that bring together a coalition of people who are actively excluded from the nation and its imagination of queerness. This challenges mainstream constructions of LGBT plus consumers in multiple ways. The clubbers are largely not white. They are of multiple class backgrounds, they are of multiple nationalities and migration statuses, and include transgender individuals. The club disidentifies with the majoritarian public sphere by reconfiguring constructions of the LGBT plus clubber to include South Asian queers with diverse identities and backgrounds. While the usual North London nights disidentify with the majoritarian public sphere conceptually, the CK Social did so physically. It brought those more distanced from and threatening to the mainstream to Soho, an area that hugely contributes to such exclusive constructions of queer people through the cultural ideological state apparatus. Where am I? Yeah. The area is home to a cluster of LGBT plus bars and clubs and is widely considered as being the home of London's main gay scene. That's not my words, that's someone else's. A Google image search for LGBT Soho reveals an overwhelming majority of white, straight-looking faces, as you can see there. A quick survey of the websites of Freedom Bar, KU Bar, Bar Soho, and GAY shows that most of these establishments charge over £5 for a single drink, meaning a visitor, alcoholic drink, meaning a visitor would need secure levels of disposable income to drink alcohol at most LGBT plus bars and clubs in Soho. Club Ghali's event brought people that are often excluded in various ways, including overt racism, from LGBT plus establishments in Soho to the area. By doing so, the CK Social adapted the geography of the queer world made by Soho's bars and clubs, thus enabling its predominantly South Asian queer visitors to briefly identify with the supposed center of the queer world in London. I should point out that even though the CK Social brought Desi is like a term for diasporic South Asians, usually. It's like contested, but whatever. It brought Desis to Bar Soho. These people still would have had secure disposable income if they wanted to drink alcohol at the event, because the drinks were similarly expensive. And, oh, I forgot. That's like pictures of Bar Soho. So you can see the kind of place we're talking about. As well as making imaginations of queer people and queer places more South Asian, Club Ghali makes imaginations of South Asia and South Asians more queer. In Impossible Desires, Queer Diasporas and South Asian Public Cultures, Gayatri Gopinath comments on the close relationship between nationalism and heterosexuality, where South Asian nationalist projects routinely stigmatize queer identities and practices. Through this relationship, queerness is rendered impossible. This is Gayatri Gopinath's quote again. Queerness is rendered impossible and unimaginable within conventional diasporic and nationalist imaginaries. That's the end of the quote. As well as Western imaginations of South Asia. Club Ghali disidentifies with these often religious nationalist projects by asserting a vision of Hinduism which, instead of violently stigmatizing and excluding it, includes queerness as a fundamental fact of pre-colonial Hindu life. It is named after the god Macaulay, recognized in Hinduism as a destroyer of evil, who is invoked in name and logo to aid the club's battles with ignorant attitudes and homophobic forces. That's a quote from their profile on the website. Through this, the club is asserting that Macaulay, and therefore Hinduism, supports queerness and considers anti-queerness an evil. Because the club projects and legitimizes this pre-colonial conception of now divergent sexualities and gender identities, it makes a world that proactively remakes historical narratives to include the minoritarian subject. Jonathan Price observed from interviews with regular visitors to Club Gali that clubgoers consistently agreed that Hinduism is a tolerant religion, replete with historical sources that sanction homosexuality. This creates a feedback loop. That's the loop. This creates a feedback loop between the alternative ideology of Hinduism and the club projecting the ideology. In this loop, clubgoers arrive with notions of a pro-queer Hinduism to be found before colonization, and their ideas are supported by the club's portrayal of Macaulay as the defender of queer South Asians. Club Gali then becomes a space of shared disidentification with the heterosexist nature of Hindu nationalism by re-articulating its imaginations of Hinduism to include queer minoritarian subjects. However, such a singular focus on a pro-queer Hinduism could passively reaffirm dominant constructions of Islam being inherently against queer sexual and gender identities. Post 9/11, the US, alongside most Western countries, including the UK, has been portrayed as feminist in relation to the Taliban's treatment of Afghani women and gay-safe in comparison to the Middle East. Western countries have advanced this homo-nationalist ideology through relentless representations of Islam as a barbaric, non-modern religion which is inherently heteropatriarchal in the majoritarian public sphere. Muslim people and pro-queer or queer-friendly social spaces have, through homo-nationalism, become understood as mutually exclusive. Club Gali fails to counter this sinister ideology through its omission of Islam from its project of re-articulating a pro-queer South Asian religion. Although the club claims to gather South Asians from multiple backgrounds together in a safe environment, it fails to include Islam in its politically charged attempts to resist heterosexist nationalist constructions of South Asian religions. In the current context of post-9/11 homo-nationalism and populist Hindu nationalism, which paints a similarly derogatory picture of Islam, this greatly undermines Club Gali's ability to disidentify with the majoritarian public sphere so that all its visitors may fit within it. So, to summarize, Club Gali adapts the conventions of the majoritarian queer club so that some South Asian queers can identify with the dominant queer world. By doing so, it engages in a practice of disidentification on two levels: the club scale reconfiguration of what queer clubbers look like, and the continual rewriting of what Hinduism sanctions. Despite the multiple ways in which Club Gali disidentifies to create a partially inclusive continent on the queer world, it fails to coherently disidentify with the various ideologies that violently separate Islam from queerness. As a result, a large minority of queer South Asians are excluded from the security, belonging, and resistance to violent anti-queer ideologies that the club aims to foster. These are some references. I want to thank Catherine Silverstone at Queen Mary, who she taught the module that I did this essay for. And I want to thank my mum for raising herself out of hell to put me here. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. And as you may or may not know, we have a Club Gali event tonight. So we may be able to more critically analyse this paper tomorrow. Okay, so finally, let me just get this up. Our final paper for this panel will be presented by Ahmad Ibrahim. Please welcome him. Ahmad is a researcher and archivist currently working at the Center for Bangladesh Studies, which is an independent think tank located in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Their primary field of interest is in development in its various shapes and forms, and the title of the paper is Between the Empire and the Modern State. So, thank you very much.
Okay, hi. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Queer Asia for organizing this conference. So my paper was already mentioned, it's called Between Empire and Modern State, Queer Invisibility and Intranslatability in Contemporary Bangladesh. So I'll get right to it. This paper aims to center a discussion on the becomings and unbecomings of queerness and queered bodies in Bangladesh by critically analyzing their orientation towards assemblages of modern, colonial, and post-colonial paradigms. In the contestation for institutional and transnational legitimization, the breadth of queerness becomes entangled with machines of expansion, ideologies of progress and civilization, and always at the same moment with the potential for anxiety and terror. My aim is to highlight a few of these confluences and assemblages, which brings in and at the same time escapes the codification of modernist thought and imperialist foundations. I'll begin my narrative with a look at how the rise and rooting of LGBT politics has led to the formation of new subjectivities and dissonance, especially after the murder of LGBT rights activists Zulhas Mannan and Mahbub Rabbi Tonoy. I will then touch upon the historical development of the Hijra at the confluence of NGOs, the state, and Hijra kinship and sociality. The final part of my discussion will introduce the Queer Archives Bangladesh, which is a project that aims to center desire and self-reflexivity using the collective practice of community archiving. Large portions of the narrative have been taken from the interviews in the Queer Archives, and I'd like to thank everyone who has participated in it so far, even though they're not here. Over the past 2 decades, LGB activism in the urban sphere of Dhaka has formed an assemblage of social machines with which it perpetuated itself and also brought itself to points of crisis. Jasbir Puad notes that queerness colludes with Western exceptionalism embedded in nationalist foreign policy via the articulation of and production of whiteness as a queer norm and tacit acceptance of US imperialist expansion. For example, the beginnings of a visibility politic in Bangladesh came about around 2008-2009 with the formation of a coalition of queer communities and social groups which culminated in a short-lived organization called the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, which had Norwegian donors among other foreign embassies and large-scale international NGOs. The intervention of foreign donors away from the already established NGO health complex regarding sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is a term called SRHR in short, and into the domain of rights activism, marked a significant change in approach which propelled the middle-class gay activists and community leaders to the forefront of visibility politics. NGOs with an explicit focus on male-to-male sexual health, and they used a term called MSM to define them, had been in existence since 1990 with the approval of the state and funded by foreign donors, even though homosexuality is still criminalized in the Bangladeshi state. While issues of hijras, lesbian women, trans and transfemme bodies revolved around myriad complexes of health, stability, sociality, and finances, the repealing of Section 377 became a primary objective for the gay community, along with mainstream acceptance and tolerance. The imposition of an international LGBT alliance imported directly the schema of a foreign state-funded liberal queerness which has established itself as the sole authority on LGBT rights violations by the Global South while turning a blind eye to violence committed by the war on terror. From the outset, the coalition seemed tenuous and it broke down as lesbian groups disavowed disability politics, citing the contextual presence of patriarchy and kinship structures, while hijra groups and lower-class non-normative groups such as Kotis, Gamchalis remained alienated from the transnational alliance due to structures of class and internal socialities, which made the NGO health complex a more suitable space for them. Through the assemblage of gayness as a self, the large machines of imperial expansion through funding and patronization from organizations such as USAID, which is a State Department-funded organization, and the already present negation of Westernism through Wahhabi-funded and sanctioned Islam, queerness became reterritorialized as LGBT and as a tool of coloniality and modernist expansion. For example, after the killings of Zulhaz and Tonoy, there you go. The Heritage Foundation, a conservative American think tank, hosted a seminar discussing the killing and how to quell extremist threats in Bangladesh. While Hindu American Foundation, Hindu American Foundation, which is a group in America which has strong ties to nationalist Hindu groups in India, called upon the US government to send a strong signal that extremism in Bangladesh will not be tolerated. At a local level, since the killings, queerness has denaturalized existing categories of LGBT and created a flux that put its meaning into crisis. This can be clearly seen at the representation of the 28 youths arrested on the outskirts of the capital city, Dhaka, last month on suspicion of homosexuality. Misnomers such as LGBT men and LGBT youth, as you can see, abounded while the police official in charge of the case said, "We think that they believe in homosexuality," referring to homosexuality or its Bengali word, shomokami, which has become associated with visibility and rights advocacy as an ideology. At the same time, rights groups and NGOs have slowly begun moving away from the tag of LGBT and begun adopting the less semiotically charged term gender and sexual minorities. According to a passage by Hector Rubalcaba in his book Translating the Queer, the meaning formation of the queer as an expression of modernity describes a traveling culture that takes the route of modern Western civilization, the route of sexual knowledge, from its status of nefarious sin to criminalization, medicalization, and finally a politics of identity and of inclusion in citizenship. The Hijra community and Hijras as part of a constituent society is publicly recognized in Bangladesh. However, Hijra is often not associated with any form of non-normative or homoerotic sexuality in the public imaginary. Over time, the site of truth-making on what comes entangled with the naming of Hijras has begun to be complicated through a process of assembly and disassembly with kinship, large private networks of NGOs, and the state. These large discursive shifts coincided with the partial move away from the health complex of SRHR, which was sexual rights and reproductive health rights, and towards advocacy and activism for rights and recognition in civil society. In November 2013, the Bangladeshi government took the decision to legally recognize Hijras as neither men nor women, but as a third gender. The recognition came in the footsteps of a pan-South Asian move towards the same after similar official recognitions were given to Hijras, Kinnars, Khwajaseras as a third gender in Nepal, India, and Pakistan. From that point, what had before been an unknown and indeed unknowable facet of Hijraness, that is desire, body, and being, began to be a site of constant public fascination. The need for a coherent identity that did not disrupt the heteronormative binaries of sexual desire and power required the presence of a coherent body. This social imperative created the space for a new field of contestations. The state's legal and discursive production of the Hijra was disabling, as they decreed the Hijra to be sexually and genitally handicapped, thereby creating the space for a third gender devoid of desire and agency to complement the heteronormative reproduction of the gender binary. Two major examples illustrate this fact. The first is the inaugural staging of the first Hijra Pride in 2014, as you can see. Bondhu, an NGO working on sexual health and on marginal sexual and gender identities, organized the event along with the Ministry of Social Welfare to mark the end of discrimination towards Hijras. The event attracted large foreign interests, including donors and embassies, who were all complicit in legitimizing the liberatory aspects of an institutionalized and recognized identity. However, in 2015, the Ministry of Social Welfare decreed that all 12 Hijras it had selected for government jobs were actually males, and thus were fake Hijras. The legitimized disabling discourse did not allow for the existence of an imaginary that might disrupt normative genders and bodies. The second telling example is that of Labonno Hijra, who along with their cohorts had accosted the killers of blogger Wasikur Rahman as they were fleeing the scene of the crime in 2015. The event prompted much discussion and it disrupted the state-sanctioned and internationally backed discourse of the third gender as helpless, as lacking agency and desire. It queered the discrete third gender identity by complicating what a Hijra body could or could not do. But the disruption resulted in the threat of physical harm for Labon no Hijra, who eventually fled the city after being hounded and harassed by media and public. And so Labon no Hijra has disappeared, and in their wake, they have left behind the assemblage of transnational alliances, state heteronormativity, and the aspiration of a coherent identity that they had queered and disrupted. Bondhu, the NGO, has been a leading voice in trying to redeem the third gender recognition by suggesting alterations to the policy. One of these include the acceptance that Hijras were previously men who have now become females. This sort of medicalized transition narrative, which has gained popularity in the West, is a reconfiguration of the imperative for civil rights and the formation of right-bearing subjects whose bodies are normalized. However, these discussions have seen strong backlash from inside the Hijra communities, where the elders, who are called the gurus and non-gurus, have refused to adopt this discourse. Again, the recurrent theme is the constant struggle for a coherent body, a coherent spatial and temporal configuration, and most importantly, a coherence that by its nature cannot be disruptive. The struggle for identity, or rather over-identities, in the post-colonies has brought us to the peripheries of an unraveling of not only the concept of body, nation-states, and language, but towards an unraveling of identity itself. And so I feel it's very important to begin imagining an indigenous futurity that has a voice in the formation of and claims to their own identities. In this juncture, the process of community and self-archiving, that is, of archiving not only one's own journey through space and time, but of archiving the stories of desire, community, pain, loss, and joy, holds the immense potential of beginning a reflexive engagement. This is where the Queer Archive Bangladesh begins its journey, in the middle of these ongoing shifts in the formation of selves. The word archive here has been deliberately used as part of reclaiming that which is considered to be dead or from the past, and to turn it into a practice for documenting the present. The archives contain the histories and thoughts of those not only at the forefront of large-scale movements of identity building, but also those who exist in the boundaries and at the peripheries of these imaginations. Interviewers from inside the community document the histories of the NGO workers, of rights activists, artists, sex workers, drag kings and queens. At the same time, the archive will employ Hijra sex workers, kotis, and lesbian women and other community members as archivists who will carry out the archiving work inside their own communities. In this case, the content as well as the process are of equal importance. While the archivist and the interviewee touch on topics of personal desire, of struggles and encounters with large assemblages of states and NGOs, the engagement itself will generate a reflexivity that provides a space where desire, pain, bodily pleasure, and bodily knowing will become centered in the production of knowledge. In the end, the archive hopes to create a repository of the past while actively producing a space in the present where assemblages of queer selves can engage in an exploration of a future beyond institutional identity struggle, where desires and trauma is acknowledged. Over time, we imagine the archive to take the form of a physical space where members of the community can engage with the archived information, come together to meet, engage in skill building development for employment outside the archives, and host regular forums for discussion. Over time, we also hope to discard the word queer from the archives, which is being employed right now as a transitional term away from LGBT and transgender. And we hope that the archiving and the community organizing develops to a point where newer terms can be mobilized. I'd like to end the talk with a request. We are a queer collective who are working with limited resources, and we recognize the importance of doing this work with low-income communities. That is why we have taken the decision to make the archive a place for employment as well. I would like to ask those who are in attendance to donate so that the archive can keep running. That's our GoFundMe address. That's our GoFundMe page, and the address is www.gofundme.com/thequeerarchive, or you can also donate in person to me. Thank you so much.
Can I invite you all to join me? Thank you very much. I'm going to wrap up first, so I've got a question for them and then I'll, yeah. Alex, can you get the banner back up? Thanks. Well, I just want to thank the panelists for really fantastic papers, and they've given us lots to talk about. So I'm just going to wrap up just for a couple of minutes, and I've got one or two questions I'd quite like the panelists to engage with, and then we'll have a Q&A. So, what does it mean to form identities beyond the box? Well, LGBT identities, queer identities, as we've seen today, but as with all identities, are tied up not only with legal and social status, but the fights for recognition and the fights for recognition based around these aspects, so identity politics per se. But they're also tied up with daily negotiations as people try to make sense of their identities as coherent and legitimate subjects within their space, time, context, and in relation to others. So I think what draws these papers together are the ways in which the authors present and discuss identity formation, whether of South Asian diasporic queer identity, queerness, loosely conceived in Bangladesh, queer performance, or through language use and negotiation. And these papers show how affirmations, compromises, choices, slippages, and assemblages occur at multiple levels in forming a sense of a coherent identity, whether for self or others. And I think the papers demonstrate also, as I might say, a general discomfort for Asian queers, as it were, for want of a different vocabulary, with negotiating Western conceptual frameworks, whether queer, LGBT, or just normative frameworks for identity formation. Whether, for example, you're negotiating what it means to be queer in the West through Club Kali spaces, or claiming through language an identity which is linked to sexuality in Palestinian and Lebanese contexts. There is a necessary negotiation with such frameworks to add to knowledge on LGBT identity groups across the globe. But at the same time, these negotiations themselves, and I think we heard about that this morning, challenge these very frameworks. And that's where discussing sexual and gender identities from an Asian perspective can problematize how we debate and conceive of sexual and gender identities overall. Literally, queering their normative designation or narrative, we might say. And I'm using queering here as a verb as Ben offered this morning. In one of the papers, although I have a feeling that Sumitra, it might have been one of the bits that was cut out, Sumitra asks what are the margins of our imaginations of queer as a category for identification, and who might fit within this imagination. She states that performance itself might provide a means of how to define queer, and in my copy of the paper that I received, she asks, this is perhaps a call out to stop putting queer in a box. I would further suggest that queerness, in not being put in a box, is that which has refused to be grounded in any particular reality, and that is where it gains its political viability as a category. And I think we heard a little bit about that this morning on the panel as well. Queer resists valuation by those in a position of normativity, and it keeps its openness and inclusivity by resisting specificity. Whether it's addressing, to bring it back to the themes of the conference, what queer desire means, what decolonization looks like, and whether decriminalization is ever enough. So queer positionality disrupts that which is normative in redressing the marginality faced by practitioners within various power systems and structures, whether gendered, sexual, social, cultural, political, regional, or global hierarchies. So I've got two comments, kind of questions for the panel to respond to. And the first is, some of you have mentioned on what queer means in the Asian context. But all of your papers obviously mention queer as a term. So, as was also discussed this morning, do you think, this is the question, do you think that the term queer is applicable to Asian communities? That is the ones mentioned in your paper. Obviously, drawing from this morning, we need to engage critically with the term. So I'd like to hear a little bit from each of you how it relates, the term queer relates to your research or the communities that you're describing. And I thought maybe, if you can, try and link it to one another's work. So, for example, Ahmad's paper engages with queer as an expression of modernity and moreover states that the term will be phased out of the queer archive eventually, and I think that's quite an important initiative. So, and then Gabriel's, for example, talks about current connections between sexuality and identity, and I think that is also something that we could discuss about. And then the second thing is that what struck me about all four papers in talking about world-making, which originally, when I think Dushant submitted it, was queer world making, but just world making, is what struck me about the papers is that they focus or mention non-state or non-institutional ways to build these worlds, whether we're talking about wider Asian contexts or Asians in the diaspora. So we've heard about disidentification with dominant cultural texts in London. We've heard about the Bangladeshi Queer Archive Project, which focuses on individuals' narratives. We've also heard about the recognition of multiple forms of queerness in India through performance, itself a tool of activism and a mode of resistance. And then also Gabriel's work on projects that focus on negotiating language use, whether coining new terms, incorporating foreign language terms, or reclaiming slurs. So the question is, in relation to queer world making, or just world making, the worlds built by people that disrupt normative narratives and structures, can you comment on how the theme of the conference, desire, fits into these worlds? What do queers, as it were, desire in their worlds? So I'll just leave you with those two things, and then we'll open up to Q&As. Thank you. So who would like to kick us off? Do you want to? Yeah, please. Yeah.
Can everyone hear?
This should work.
Oh, cool.
Yes.
Before I answer the question, I wanted to point out that there was a slide in Ibrahim's presentation with an article saying the Hindutva, which is a Hindu nationalist kind of group formulation thing. What was it like? It's
Queer Bangladesh, the next Hindutva project.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, and I welcome you guys to build on this, that the Hindutva, the Hindu nationalist project, is possibly the biggest threat to queer identities and queer people in India and probably the Indian diaspora as well right now. There's nothing queer about it. It's entirely heterosexist. It's hell-bent on killing queer people, and that's happening right now. So do I think the term queer is applicable to Asian communities? I think doing my work in a British context where, you know, queer is a huge term that communities organize around and communities work with. I honestly don't know any words that I would use beyond that. And it was great to hear presentations from you three giving me a kind of language that I can move forward with. So I don't think it's just applicable, but I think it's currently, it feels like the only term that I have access to when researching or when existing as a queer Asian, as a noun.
Just a few comments on, is it on?
Yeah.
On what you said. I do think there is a general discomfort in the Arab world in general, by the general population, by the general LGBTQI population, with this binary framework that is actually being continued by the new set of words that were created by activist groups. And there's also the fact that these activist groups were at first very grassroots and have become progressively institutionalized, very much what Ibrahim said about what NGOs in Bangladesh, it is the same thing in Lebanon, and not in Palestine because Palestine is still very grassroots. And there are new groups, they're really adopted super liberal Western discourse. Before I was like, yeah, we have to see how this is being translated on the ground, but right now there was, last month there was the first Pride Week and the Pride Parade in Beirut, and the discourse was so homo-nationalist. They were at first, they were actually saying that the police was there to protect them, blah, blah, whereas there's still a law, there's still a law in the penal code, the code in Lebanon that prohibits sexual practices against nature, which is still used for homosexuality. So this general discomfort is met with this institutionalization of the movement, which actually just increases this discomfort and makes you wonder what queer means now. Because when I interviewed on this group, of course it was a while ago, and it was when there was still some radicality in the activists and activist groups in Lebanon. Everyone would describe themselves, except for a few exceptions, everyone would use the word queer in English, even when they're speaking Arabic, like queer. So we have to wonder what does queer mean in this context. Yeah. Sometimes I think it's become something very, very elitist. Actually, to describe myself as queer, it means, oh, I read Judith Butler and no matter what, you know?
Okay, I think going back to the question and speaking a little bit more about the formation of the archives and how the term queer came to be there. So the part of the world that I live in and the people who are working on the archive live in has a very long history of colonization, and it just does not date back to British expansion. It goes back to when when the Mughals came, and then before then, when the Brahmins sort of came there. And so there's a lot of history there, and I think it would be wrong to suggest that criminalization or sort of alternative sexual practices were just looked down upon right after British colonialism. So there's a long history of it. And just going back to two of the papers, I think Dushant's paper, which spoke about disidentification and how sort of Club Kali is turning a lot of Hindu mythology into this sort of queer-friendly or queer-sanitized space. And the problem with naming is just that I can go back and look at Bangladeshi history, and a lot of times I'd either find it linked directly to some sort of Sanskritized and Hinduized mythology, which does have mentions of words which might be able to describe what we're trying to do, but then at the same time, without my intention, it gets linked to these assemblages of Hindutva, and Hindu American foundations will come out supporting us. And so there's a big problem of assemblages that cannot be controlled all the time. And so I think in that regard, turning back and looking into history of a space which had been colonized at least 3 or 4 times presents a big problem in turning to the past and finding a name. And so that's why we sort of decided to put a transitional name and over time discard it and come up with whatever develops over time and see where that goes. And then if that goes away, we'll discard that too. And I think it goes back to also Gabriel's quote from Hellem's founder. It said, "We are not agents of the West," but I think that it's always there and that you can't really move away from it. So that assemblage or that linkage will always be present whether we like it or not. And so is queer applicable? I don't know if I can answer that question, but queer is there and it's definitely necessary and also inadequate and indispensable, as we heard in the keynote speech. But I think we need to negotiate and renegotiate it. And instead of looking back, I think what we're doing in the archives is trying to move forward and think of words or think of community spaces which might not necessarily have terms of definitions, because there is no direct translation of queer in Bangla. There's only a word for homosexuality, which is shomokami, and then there's also a contestation between that, because kam means sex, and there's another term called shomopremi, and prem means lover. So there's homosexuality, which is shomokami, and then there's shomopremi, which is loving or being with someone of the same sex. And then if I go back further, there are terms like ardhangini or ardhonarishwar, which means half man and half woman. But then again, as I said, it links back to that sort of Hindu world-making or Hindu creationist discourse, which will come back to cause a lot of violence, especially in low-income queer communities. And so, yes, I think queer is applicable as a transitional term and as a temporary one, but it has to be stressed that it has to be discarded over time. Yeah.
Yeah, so what I wanted to say about whether it's applicable has been covered by all of my colleagues here. But I'd just like to say a little thing about desire. I think all of us right now are speaking of this desire to break out these terms, like the archive has taken this transitional label, but in time there will be no label or new terms. So there is this desire to sort of unpack what queer has informed us in Western contexts, and maybe take from our history, maybe take from heritage, but also renew this meaning of the term. So this desire is to basically create a way to talk about ourselves. So in that sense, the desire fits into all of what we're trying to talk about. Yeah. And yeah, that's what I'd like to just put out there.
May I just add something?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Yeah, reacting to what Ibrahim said about sorry, is this a new word, or I guess it was coined by the word for homosexuality? In
I think the word like really gained popularity around 2002 or 2003 when online gay groups and gay dating sites popped up.
Quite similar to Mithlī in Arabic. There's also this, I think there is a desire, and it's a general desire within the especially gay and not queer activist groups all over the world, there's a desire to erase desire. And I think the discomfort with the word sexuality and homosexuality comes from that, and I see that in Lebanon, especially in Lebanon, and other parts, especially in some countries where they're still struggling to create an actual activist group, like Egypt. The question of like actually saying the word sexuality and actually talking about sex is quite problematic. There is, for instance, in Brazil, a lot of activist groups don't use the word homosexuality anymore. They use affective. So they're talking about affect. They don't want to talk about sexuality because they think homosexuality is so much more than sexuality is about affect. But by doing that, you actually erase the entire issue, which is sexual deviance. It's not having the same sexual practices as everyone else.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a great place to start taking some questions from. So does anyone have any questions for any of our panelists? I mean, you can talk more specifically, of course, about their paper. Yeah. Hang on, sorry.
Thank you all for the wonderful papers.
Could you give us your name and affiliation as well, if you're comfortable doing so? Thank you.
My name is Macaulay. I'm now studying in Sussex University, and following the speeches earlier, and we have wonderful presentations today, and I found that it's really a difficult question to define, or what it means by queerness. So I tried to ask otherwise, because I found there is a common enemy that everyone talks about, is heteronormative nation. So I tried to ask, then what do we mean by heteronormative nation? If heteronormativity really is a requirement of a nation due to its presumed requirement of a permanent population according to law or politics, then is this something that the queerness try to be against or or try to be contradictory purposefully. And in this case, I'm wondering if heteronormativity is a requirement of a nation. Should we understand it as how we try to theorize queerness, that it represents and manifests variably in different contexts as well? Because it seems that everyone talks about heteronormativity like presuming everyone knows what it means. So, if it should be different in different contexts or in different regions or societies, then I wonder how all of you define or what you mean when you talk about heteronormative nation or heteronormativity in your research. Thank you very much.
It's a great question. Who would like to have a go?
I can start. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's actually the center of the debate I evoked about sexual identities in the Middle East against Joseph Massad, the famous scholar, against other scholars and mostly LGBTQ activists in Lebanon, because what Massad says is that by inciting discourse about sexuality in the Middle East, those groups are actually rendering the nation, the state, heteronormative, whereas before it would be mostly tolerant of non-heterosexual practices as long as they weren't talked about, as long as they stayed within four walls. But the argument of the LGBT groups is that the nation state isn't necessarily heteronormative. It was born that way. You can even think about the root of the word nation, Latin natio, which is the same root as nascent or native, to be born or to give birth. So it comes from this idea that you have a system that will make everything to people to continue to give birth. So heterosexuality would be one of the pillars of this system. So there's a question whether the nation necessarily, the modern nation state is necessarily heteronormative, and by exporting this model, the West exported heteronormativity with it, or if at first it was neutral, and then by talking about sexuality, by inciting discourse, you create a heteronormative state is central to the issues I study, and I tend to believe that the modern nation state is necessarily heteronormative. It is one of the pillars with racism and patriarchy of the nation state, and the proof is that when you have laws against homosexuality in the West, in the global South, they were usually implemented by colonial powers. That's the case in Lebanon. That's the case, I know in Egypt and all over the Arab world, maybe in Africa too. So by retracing the origin of those laws, you can also see the heteronormative, like the normalization of heterosexuality. That's what heteronormativity means. In the colonial process of exporting nation states.
I just want to clarify, was your question more about like how we're using the term heteronormative with our work, or like its relation to the nation state?
Yeah,
Both.
yeah, basically I want to know how you define heteronormative in your research, but if you can clarify more about how it links to, because I don't know, but I have the feeling that heteronormative is part of the colonization project before, that when the ideology of nation state is exported around the world, we start to understand nation in a way that it is with permanent population and being required to be normative in terms of sexuality. So yeah, that's what I want to ask this question.
Cool. In this paper, I was talking about heterosexism because I think that makes it a bit more specific than heteronormativity, where to me, heterosexism is a woman who's been told she's a woman all her life in an abusive relationship with a man who's been told he's a man all his life. And that kind of is the way relationships, or at least romantic relationships, happen in the nation. Its relationship to the nation, I think, yes, heteronormativity is an ideology. I think it is something that we've seen spread through European colonization, but I don't want us to fall into the trap of thinking that pre-colonial societies across the world were perfect either, because clearly there is a kind of if you run along biological lines, it's very easy to fall into heteronormativity, and I don't imagine the homogenized European culture to be the only culture in the world, in all of human civilization, to come up with that idea of an abusive relationship between a man who's been told he's a man all his life and a woman who's been told she's a woman all her life.
So I'd like to speak a little bit about how heteronormativity, or the term, related to how I used it in the paper. And I think I used it in one section where 12 hijras were told they were actually fake hijras and they were actually men, and that they wouldn't get the jobs because they're not really hijras. And so I think heteronormativity is part of the larger ideas or systems that hold up the nation, or is one of the ways in which the nation is or perpetuates itself and makes sense to itself. So I think a lot of heteronormativity specifically is the idea of coherence, which is what a nation does do, that inside the nation, these are my citizens, and these citizens have rights. There are certain coherent rights which the state will uphold to those it decrees as citizens. And so part of that forming of the coherence of what a citizen is or isn't is this formation of heteronormativity, that my citizens will be heteronormative in that I understand what's inside their pants, and that I understand what they're going to do at night, or I understand which bathroom they're going to go to. And so I think with regard to what I have spoken about, I think heteronormativity is that sort of desire for coherence, which walking down the tube, you can look at me in the dress I'm wearing and you might wonder, you might sort of be in crisis, what is this person doing here? What are they going to do? And sort of heteronormativity is one of the ways in which people look at each other and are safe and secure inside the nation state and feel that there's a coherent person, that I know this person is going to work, I know this person is going to the male bathroom. So yeah.
Yeah, so so my work largely deals with performance, but I'm looking at heteronormativity as seeing the popular imaginary of the gay man being effeminate or the transgender person as a sexual predator. So there have been performers who have taken traditional forms like the Yakshagana, that is a dance form in Karnataka, where the man performs the role of a woman and a man. But what one of my, a friend of mine, Sharanya Ramprakash, is doing is she is a woman and she plays a man on stage. So there is that queering where I've also mentioned in my paper, it has been a practice in queer spaces and not art practice that is queered. So for me, heteronormativity is basically, we are trying to problematize that by queering art practice. So if a man is performing the roles of a woman and a man, when a woman goes on stage and sort of enacts the role of a man, she's querying that space, and she's also sort of questioning what heteronormative means. Like, this is my understanding of it. So I don't know if that clarifies or adds context.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so if you have a burning question, obviously come and address any of our panelists in person. I'm sure they welcome that.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the wonderful paper.